So good morning, everyone. Thanks a lot for this opportunity to come back to my place of birth and interact with the technology and the startup community. I really think it's an honor. By way of quick background, so I was part of the founding team at SlideShare, and SlideShare was acquired by LinkedIn in 2012. And I happened to work at LinkedIn for about 3 years post that acquisition. And in 2015 was when I actually moved out of LinkedIn. And by some quirk of fate, in a very unplanned kind of a way, I ended up working for the government of India. And that's what I've been doing for the past 4 years. More specifically, this is, so if you've heard of Digital India is the digital initiative which is run by the Ministry of Electronics and IT. And I am part of MIT, and there's a platform called DigiLocker, and so I happen to be the architect for that. I've known Abhishek for some time, and I think he's very active in the technology and the tech community in India, and specifically in East India. And I remember our discussion some time back, and when we were talking about what is it that he invited me to this event, and I said, yeah, it will be great for me to go back to Kolkata. And one of the things that came up was, what would be the topic of my conversation? And I asked him that I'm happy to actually speak about anything that you suggest. And so both Abhishek and Syed came up with product virality, that they wanted me to speak about virality. And when I look back at my SlideShare journey, there were many things that we did right, and there were many things that we did wrong. But if there is one thing that we actually completely nailed it, we completely hit bullseye, that was achieving virality in the product itself. So SlideShare grew, and we did not spend any marketing dollars in acquiring our customers and our users. And I think this is an imperative that every business on the internet faces. So I think it's a very apt topic for me to be speaking about. And frankly, we are now in 2019, and when I look back at the early years of SlideShare was born in 2006. In many ways, it looks like a different era now, to be honest, right? What I have seen and what I have learned is that the internet essentially, tends to do a somersault every 5 years. Every 5 years, you'll see a bunch of new things come up. Many of the old things just fall by the wayside. But having said that, I think there are certain things that are timeless. There are certain foundational principles about the internet that are timeless. And my attempt here over the next 15 minutes is to essentially talk about some of these foundational principles that helped SlideShare go viral. And the hope is that some of those principles can act as takeaways for the audience here. So going back to the SlideShare story, I mean, my presentation is actually not a lot about the story, but I just want to focus a little bit on the way we started, because I think that has a lot of relevance to the whole issue of virality. So SlideShare was essentially born at an unconference event that happened in New Delhi in 2006. People who might remember that this whole thing about unconferences began with something called bar camps. And we were in Delhi in 2006 organizing the first bar camp in India. And this was a day-long event where there were a lot of people from the technology space. Since it was the first event in India, there were a lot of people from other cities who had come over. And what happened was there was a bunch of presentations at the event. And at the end of the day, when the event got over, the speakers from the day, actually they started coming to us because we were the organizers, and they started handing their PowerPoint presentations to us. Somebody would give us a flash drive, somebody would say, I'll email it to you, somebody said, okay, I'll burn a CD and give it to you. And on the other hand, we saw people from the audience come and say, hey, you know what, I like that speaker's presentation. Can you help me get a copy of that? So because we were the organizers, we found ourselves in between those two groups of people. And we said, yeah, of course, we'll try to help you out and get hold of these presentations. But there's something that we noticed there. And it was interesting to see that there were many people who had taken photographs and they had shot videos, and there seemed to be no problem in terms of sharing those artifacts. People said, I'll upload it to Flickr. So this, at that time, Flickr was big. This is the pre-Facebook era. So people said, I'll upload it to Flickr or I'll upload it to YouTube, and you can just go and search using the hashtag and you should be able to find it. And for us, that was kind of the aha moment. We said, you know what, wait a minute. There seems to be no problems with the sharing of these personal objects like photos and videos, but what about presentations? What about PowerPoint? A lot of the archival value of this event is actually captured in the form of these presentations. And these presentations today are essentially, after this event is over, they're going to die on people's desktops and their Windows folders. So is there a way that we can actually have a platform that allows these presentations to start a life on the internet from this day onwards? We started looking around when we found that there incidentally was no such event, and to us that was the trigger for SlideShare. We said, okay, this looks like an important problem, and it seems like there's nobody on the internet who's actually thought about it, or if they've not thought about it, or maybe they have thought about it, they haven't built it. So we started actually building a prototype for that. And it took us about 6 months to build out the prototype. And as I said, one of our inspirations was clearly what we saw with YouTube and Flickr. We were really enamored of the fact that they had actually managed to create a community, create a hub, create a destination where people from the internet were coming and they were actually interacting over these objects. So in a very similar way, we said that, okay, you know what, this is what we should try to build the product like. We should essentially create a hub for professional and educational content. And in many ways, if I were to look back, I'd say that this was a novel idea, and in many ways, this is the real innovation that SlideShare has brought to the table, which is to take the idea of social and apply it to professional and educational content, right? But going back to the virality angle, so what happened was, once the prototype was ready, we started showing it to some friends, we showed it to some VCs, we started showing it to other conference organizers. And as we kind of, took it around, we realized that there was a fundamental problem with our hypothesis behind the product. And what was that problem? The problem was that, remember, this is 2006. So for any product to succeed, you needed support from the early adopter crowd. And for many people in technology who are early adopters, the word PowerPoint was kind of an anathema. People used to hate PowerPoint. There were PowerPoint jokes floating around on the internet. PowerPoint was the subject of jokes and ridicule. PowerPoint reminded people of offices and meetings. It reminded people of Microsoft, which was in a very different avatar at that time. PowerPoint jokes coming and clogging people's email inboxes was something that everybody was scared of. So the fact was that to a lot of people, they didn't really think very highly of PowerPoint as a medium. And here we were trying to actually come up with a product where the PowerPoint was at the center of this particular community. So to us, this looked like an existential problem. That how are we going to create a destination where the object which is at the center of this destination is essentially the object of ridicule? So we didn't have an answer to this question. But we thought that this problem is going to be standing in our way. And in many ways, it's going to make the difference between also ran application and a globally successful phenomenon if we could make it. And so this is where the concept of virality actually comes in. And I would actually like to reflect on a few slides that I have here. If you see this slide, you'll get a visual imagery behind virality, because virality is derived from viral diseases and how they spread. And in many ways, virality means the ability of an object to self-replicate, which is to create multiple copies of itself. The word virality, incidentally, many times it is used interchangeably with words like marketing, with words like buzz, with word of mouth. But virality actually has a very specific meaning. Virality means that you are trying to increase the width of your product and not necessarily your depth. And this is actually a fairly highly debated topic in the startup world, this width versus depth debate. Because by width, what you're essentially trying to do is that you're trying to increase the distribution. And by depth, what you're trying to do essentially is that you're trying to essentially increase the engagement. So all startups have this kind of questions right at the start, is that should I focus on distribution or should I focus at engagement? And at SlideShare as well, we were kind of confronted with this question, is that as we go about bringing this product, what should we really focus on? And remember, this was 2006, so now in 2019, if you go to the internet, and you'll find there's a lot of experience sharing, there's a lot of information about some of these issues on the internet. If you can go and just search it, you'll find the answers to those questions. But back then in 2006, that was not the case. So, having talked about virality, I would like to kind of reflect a little bit about startups in general. So I think there are three defining principles about startups, which I would like to talk about very briefly, and I think they are very pertinent to this debate. So the first thing that comes to, that's on the screen, so there's a very famous book, there's a very famous article actually by Paul Graham, where he talks about startups, and he says that startups is equal to growth. This is the equation that he has actually formulated. And this, basically what it tells you is that the whole business of startups, so the way to define startups, is essentially by the shape of your growth curve. The shape of your growth curve is essentially your life. You live and die by it. This is just the fundamental truth about startups. And if you're trying to do a startups, I would seriously recommend that you should go and read that post by Paul Graham. The second defining point about startups that I would like to talk about is the evolutionary journey that startups go through. So every startup starts from 0, it goes to 1, then it goes to 5. From 5 it goes to 10, and then it goes to 50, and then it goes to 100. So it's like an evolutionary journey. And the important thing to realize here is that at different stages of the journey, you could actually be doing very different things. What you might do at the initial phase of the startup's journey would be very different from what you would do in a 50 to 100 kind of a phase here. So this is again one of the defining characteristics of startups that I feel is important from a virality perspective, and I'll come to it later. And I think the third thing that is the third point I'd like to make is that startups are not supposed to be perfect. The reality is that people don't expect perfect products and perfect services from startups, and that's an advantage that startups have. Startups can be good enough, and in fact, in many ways, the word MVP that we use all the time essentially is born out of this phenomenon that startups don't necessarily need to be perfect. They can be just good enough, right? So how are these 3 points, startups about growth, the evolutionary journey of the startups not being perfect, how are they related to the concept of virality? I think if you put these 3 points together and you think about the definition of virality, then you will naturally and automatically come to what I'm trying to point out. What this essentially means is that when you are at the 0 to 1 stage of your startup's evolutionary journey, when you are at that incipient stage, when you're just about to starting or trying to create something, the thing that really matters to you is growth. Growth is the lifeblood of your journey at that point in time. And you have to kind of prioritize growth over anything else. And prioritizing growth by me, what I mean is that essentially distribution. It's okay to kind of say that for the moment, for the 0 to 1 kind of a phase, I am going to essentially go all in for distribution, and I'm willing to kind of make a little bit of trade-offs, right? So, and that's the way to achieve virality. So virality is directly linked to distribution. And how do you achieve virality is via product design. Is that what you essentially do is that you try to bias the design of your product in ways so that it essentially is prioritizing virality over other things. And what this equation actually tells you is that in every trade-off, you actually are winning something and you are losing something, right? There is never a perfect answer. And this is one of the sayings that our CEO used to use very often, is that design never gives you perfect answers. It always gives you compromises. It always gives you trade-offs. And when you make a trade-off, you are essentially winning something and then you are losing something. And so that's exactly what happened at SlideShare, is that we knowingly biased the design of the product towards virality. In doing so, we were aware of the fact that there were certain trade-offs that we were making, and those trade-offs would need to be addressed at a different point in time. So just to give you an example, if you are on SlideShare, and even today this is kind of been the case even under LinkedIn, is that you can actually view presentations while you are logged out, right? You don't need to log in to view presentations. So I would give this as an example of a trade-off that was made in the design right back when we started SlideShare. Because what this does is that it essentially is prioritizing and biasing the product towards speed of content consumption. But what are you losing in that process? Because you are giving it out logged out, then you don't get people to sign up, right? So you're kind of foregoing a part of the signed in users that you would have, the information that you would have about users once they are logged in. So it's an intelligent trade-off that you have made. On a SlideShare product page, you can actually see that the transcripts of the presentation are laid out in the HTML, right? So this is biasing the product for search engine optimization, right? But the trade-off that you are making is that it makes the page heavy, it makes it cluttered, and that at some point in time you're going to have to address it. If you try to upload a presentation on SlideShare, unlike many other similar services, we'll actually not force you to give us metadata like categories and tags. It's an optional thing, right? This is again an example of a trade-off where we are essentially prioritizing fast content acquisition over metadata. And metadata is actually very important for things like product recommendations, for search engines, and so on. So the point that I'm trying to make at an overall level is that what we did at SlideShare was that we completely kind of went all in for distribution via these small design trade-offs that are kind of interspersed through the entire design of the application. But this overall strategy actually worked very well for us. We grew really fast. SlideShare never spent any money on marketing. And in many ways, the existential problem of PowerPoint being a boring medium, we were able to overcome this via the viral nature of the product. So, in summary, what I would like to say is that there are different ways of achieving virality on the internet today. You can have content-based virality. You can have a very good example of a content-based virality is this Indian company Ixigo. You might have seen, brilliant content marketing videos that they make and let loose on the internet. So that's a great example of virality from via content. You can have virality via network effects. So something like Skype when it initially launched, where you can only kind of talk to somebody on Skype if he or she also have a similar Skype account. So that's an example of virality via network effects. And thirdly is the example of virality via products. And products like YouTube and SlideShare kind of fall into this bucket. And to my mind and in my experience, the virality via products is probably the most powerful kind of virality that you can achieve. Because if you are able to inject virality into the product at the design stage itself. What you are essentially doing is that you are injecting marketing into the product. You don't need marketing as a separate function. The product markets itself. And we are very fortunate at SlideShare that we were able to achieve this, and that kind of led to the success behind SlideShare. So that's all I have right now. And I'm going to be around this event for the entire day. I'm happy to take questions, and if there are any specific tips, there's obviously a whole science behind virality. I didn't get into that at this stage. It tends to get a little mathematical as well at times. There's a lot of analytics. There's a lot of psychology also involved. So in case anybody is interested, I'm happy to kind of walk him or her through some of the nuances behind it. Thank you. Thanks a lot.